Just one of these mistakes can make a reader hate your book. But don't worry, in this video, it's not going to be a long gripe fest of everything that's going wrong. I'm also going to give you very specific advice on how you can avoid these mistakes. And the very first one that we're going to tackle is sequel baiting. Sequel baiting is real. It's affected you, and it's affected those you love. When the end of a novel doesn't wrap up cleanly, but instead just entices you to try to buy the next novel, that's sequel baiting. And I think there are two ways that you can try to avoid this in your own book. The first is keeping your order of priorities right. Your first priority always needs to be wrapping up this particular book, making the reader satisfied with this ending. And then say a secondary priority is making the reader want to buy the next book and figure out what happens next. Now the trouble comes when you invert those priorities and you make the most important thing getting the reader to buy the next book rather than, closing off this story. A second thing you should absolutely do is think about the percentage of resolutions you're offering. If you are resolving, say, 30% of the open storylines in a particular novel, and yet you're leaving 70% of them open, your readers are going to be very dissatisfied with that. They're gonna feel cheated. The much better thing that you should do is resolve, say, 95% of open storylines, and then just dangle one thing at the end that will make the reader a little bit curious about what happens in the sequel. This next one is something that makes me personally very angry, and it is number 2, endings that change the genre. This is when you have a story that's bumbling along, going, and then suddenly when you reach the climax or the end, the book changes to a completely different genre. For an example of this, look at Indiana Jones, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So the story is going along, it feels like a normal Indiana Jones movie, but then, out of nowhere, it was aliens at the end. So the genre was, it's campy adventure, and then shifts radically at the end to sci-fi. Really, the problem here is similar to a Deus Ex Machina, where basically a god comes down into the play and sort of solves all the problems for people. So the issue with this is not only are your characters becoming very passive, it's also that an outside force is swooping in and solving all the problems in the book. So the solution to this is pretty simple. Your endings have to correspond to the genre that you've set up over the course of the entire book. Now, if you're struggling with endings and you want a little more help on it, I would recommend subscribing to Bookfox Academy. Specifically check out the Write Your Best Novel course because it helps you with stuff like what happens before the climax, what are the main things you should do in a climax, what are common mistakes in the climax, and then endings and looking at case studies of endings and helping authors figure out exactly what the right ending is for their book. Anyhow, check it out. It's helped a lot of authors already. I think it can help you too. The third one is probably my biggest pet peeve when reading a book, and it is number 3, good characters presented as evil, and vice versa. So I should say right off the bat that this is not universal. What I find moral might be completely different than what you find moral. But as a reader, when I sense that the author is trying to warp my moral compass in some way, that makes me very, very angry. I'm gonna give you a very silly example of this, and then I'm gonna give you 2 more serious ones. In Love Actually, remember the guy who's in love with his best friend's wife? It's played off in the movie as he's like, innocent and sweet sort of puppy love, but dude, this guy is a creepy, weird stalker who only films her at the wedding and then comes to her house with those little note cards and gets a kiss from her. I mean, he's really giving off these crazy stalker vibes, am I wrong? So for a little more serious example, let's look at Celeste Ng's Little Fires Everywhere. The frustration I had with this book is that she seemed to judge characters as good or evil based on their identity rather than what they did. So the rich person is evil not because of what she does, but simply because she's rich. And the poor person is good not because she does anything that's particularly good, but simply because she's poor. That really rubbed me the wrong way, and honestly, I read that book feeling like my moral apprehension of the main characters was completely different than the author's. And for a third example, let's look at John Updike's Rabbit Run. I'm gonna level with you right now. I absolutely detest John Updike. Absolutely hate the guy. And I'll tell you why. In Rabbit Run, he writes this monstrously narcissistic character, just this real scumbag of a human being. And then makes this guy into a hero and pretends that he's perfectly normal. I felt like I was being gaslighted for the entire novel, and the trouble was I didn't think that the author knew that this character, probably based on him, was a horrible human being, but I knew he was a horrible human being. I'm gonna side with what David Foster Wallace said about Updike. He called him a penis with a thesaurus, and I think that's probably the best dig I've ever heard about an author. So what's the solution to this? The solution is you got to know your audience. You have to make sure that your moral sensibilities are going to match what your reader's moral sensibilities are. And you can't please everyone, right? But different audiences are going to have different senses of morality. You just want to make sure that your ideal reader is going to really connect with who is good and who is evil in your book. The fourth thing that readers hate, and honestly this is kind of a funny one, is characters making stupid decisions just to serve the plot. Now you can find this across every single genre, right? No genre is exempt from this, but I am going to pick on one genre right now, the horror genre. Because how many times in the horror genre do you see a person walking towards that door that nobody wants them to open and nobody thinks it's a good idea, but they're gonna open that door? So you have characters crawling into a pipe to investigate a corpse in Jeepers Creepers. In I Know What You Did Last Summer, you have characters who are running for their life, but just before they make it to safety, they just stop and turn around. Or there are extremely clear signs that something is really messed up with the house, and the characters just seem to ignore it all. Now, why do they do this? Well, I mean, it's because the plot would be very boring if nobody gets killed. But the solution is a little bit harder to implement. You have to make sure that the decisions that a character makes stems from their motivations, from their psychology, from their personality. They cannot decide to do something which is completely out of step with who the reader understands them to be. If they are a smart person, then you need to justify if they make a bad decision or a dumb decision. Every choice that they make in your book should stem from their deepest sense of self. Now, the next mistake, which can really turn readers off, is number 5, preachy novels. Now listen, I'm all about messages in a book. There's nothing wrong with that, right? We write books because sometimes we have ideas that we want to get across. But don't go too far and make it preachy or propaganda. The French actually came up with this very useful division to talk about this particular topic. They divide between novel of ideas and the thesis novel. Now, the novel of ideas is just a novel which grapples with a whole bunch of ideas, sometimes contradictory ideas. It's not lecturing, but it's bringing up really serious topics to wrestle with. A thesis novel, on the other hand, is very much propaganda. There is one right answer, and they are gonna hammer you over the head with it to make sure no reader could possibly miss the point they're making. Now, whether you agree with the message in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged is kind of beside the point. I think we can all agree that that is a thesis novel, and the premier example of that would be, say, an 80-page speech by John Galt, where he clearly lays out like all of Ayn Rand's ideas about objectivism. So what do you do to avoid this mistake? One, I think you have to get very clearly in your head what is fiction and what is nonfiction. If your goal is solely to create a message, then you have to ask yourself, do I really want to be writing a nonfiction book instead? And if you decide to write fictional books, then you have to stick with that genre. You can't suddenly transition in the middle and start just writing essays in the middle of your book, making your points. The goal in a novel of ideas is to allow the story itself to make the point and allow the characters, how they change, what decisions they make, allow them to make the point. So for a very simplified example of this, I have edited more than 1,000 children's books. And sometimes at the end, authors will have like a couple of pages explaining what the point of the story was. And 99% of the time I have to tell them, look, rely upon the power of the story to make your point. The story's already like teaching you that bullying is bad. You don't need to say, hey, kids, bullying is bad at the end. It's too heavy. You're hammering the reader over the head and it's just redundant. Now, the last way that you can avoid this mistake is don't start your book with the message or the theme. And I don't mean don't have it on the first page or something like that. What I mean don't start with is when you're thinking about a book, don't start your whole process by being like, this is the idea I want to get across. No, you start with character. You start with a scene. You start with something concrete in the real world. And as you go through the writing process, then the themes and the points emerge naturally inside of the story. But the story has to be first and foremost. And now it's time for the next dangerous mistake, which is number 6, exposition aimed at the reader. So I'm just gonna give you a really silly example of this so you know what I'm talking about. You know how your daughter died a year ago and you've been struggling to keep your spirits up during the zombie apocalypse, which wiped out 99% of humanity? And the other guy's like, Yeah, dialogue is not a place to explain backstory. I'll say it again, dialogue is not a place to explain backstory. Now, of course you can mention things obliquely, but if you're finding that a character is being like, this is what happened and we both know it, then you're probably doing expository dialogue. The goal with dialogue, the goal is figure out what would realistically be said in this conversation. Put yourself in their shoes. What would they actually say to one another? Now, of course, you have to have in the back of your head, okay, what sort of information does the reader need to know as well? But the first and foremost thing is, what would these characters actually say to one another? This next point is one that I'm sure has pissed off many of you, and it's number 7, rushed endings. Now, I don't have a point with you ending your story in media res, right? If you're ending in a particular pivotal moment, say before a character decision or something, those type of ambiguous endings can work quite well for some books. What I do have a problem with, and what I think a lot of readers have a problem with, is major plot points being resolved really quickly, like almost brushed over. Listen, your reader has been waiting the entire novel for this payoff. So when you get to the payoff, don't rush through that. Like, that's the reward they've been looking for. And a second thing that's super annoying is really huge character arcs suddenly and abruptly resolved in some way. So you see major character change and like the antagonist is suddenly like, oh, like a generally nice guy and has a huge change of heart. You can't rush something like that. You really have to take your time in a scene and make the reader believe that character change is real. And then the third thing I'd tell you to do to avoid a rushed ending is make sure your internal conflict is resolved just as much as the external conflict. What I see as an editor, and by the way, I'm opening up some slots for editing, so if you are watching this video and you would like to get some editing from me, check the link in the description and you can see my rates and sort of how I work. But back to the topic. What I see as an editor is that authors will resolve all the external conflict, but they really give short thrift to resolving the internal conflict that we've cared about for the entire storyline. Now, internal conflict could be something like them being really cowardly at the beginning and suddenly they're a lot braver at the end. It could be something like affection and not revealing their affection, or being too timid at the beginning, but at the end, like they outright say it and tell someone they love them. I mean, internal can be a lot of different things, but you have to focus on internals just as much as you do on the externals if you want the ending to feel satisfying. Then my final rule for making sure that endings don't feel rushed is make sure the ending is proportional. If you are writing a 500-page book, you're gonna need 10 to 15 pages to wrap everything up after the climax. You just gotta take that amount of time. Now, if your book's 150 pages, then sure, yeah, you might need, say, only 3 to 5 pages to wrap things up. But I think authors get in trouble when they have like a huge book and then the story completely wraps up in 2 or 3 pages. And the reader's like, I feel blindsided. Like, the story can't end that quickly. Remember that the ending of a story is a way to usher the reader out of your world and back into the real world. That takes time, okay? So don't rush the process. The 8th mistake that a lot of writers make is treating the audience as if they're stupid. One example of this would be simply having too much explanation. Remember that explanation in your novel works on sort of a bell curve, right? And over here you have way too much explanation and you're treating the reader as stupid. Over here you have way too little explanation and the reader's confused. So the goal is to hit that sweet spot right in the center and make sure the reader has just enough so they can feel like they're figuring things out, and not so little they're confused, or so much that they feel like you think they're stupid. And I'll give you an example of this. So I read a large variety of genres. I think you can tell from the examples I use in my videos. And one of the things I read is sci-fi. I started up a sci-fi book club years ago, and we read this book called The Legacy of Heorot by Larry Niven. Halfway through the book, I realized, oh, this is a retelling of Beowulf, because they killed this beast and then suddenly the mother comes around and they're like, oh no. Now, as a reader, I felt smart for figuring out, oh, like this is a retelling of Beowulf. But you know what they did after that point? They mentioned Beowulf like 100 times. They called all the creatures Grendels. They had characters talking about the narrative of Beowulf and like how this story mirrored it. And I'm like, you know, I just feel like you're treating me like I'm dumb right now. Like, I figured it out and now you're bashing me over the head. Now, this piece of advice definitely depends on your audience. You have to figure out for your particular audience what is too much explanation and what's too little explanation. But once you figure that out, I beg you, don't explain too much to the reader. And the ninth thing that readers hate when they encounter it in a novel is unnecessary redundancies. Now, this can take a lot of different forms, but let me give you 3 different examples. The first one is dialogue recap. This is a character telling another character what's happened. But if the reader already knows what's happened, it's really, really boring for them because they're like, I know this already. Really, your goal in a situation like that is just summarize it, you know? Say, this character told this character what had happened. There. 1 sentence, you're done. A second thing that feels really redundant is repeating the stakes. Now, don't get me wrong, you do need to repeat the stakes once or twice so the reader knows what's at stake. Like, the stakes are very important. But what I see sometimes in books is that they'll be repeated 4, 5, 6 times, and I'm like, I know what the stakes are already. Stop saying it so much. Like, if we don't get to X place, like, we're all gonna die. I get it. A third redundancy, which can be super annoying, is physical traits or gestures. If that character fondles the locket with their picture of their dead lover in it 1 more time, I'm gonna go bonkers. Or if the author calls her a feisty redhead 1 more time, I am gonna throw this book across the room. Look, it's fine on the first draft to write your book really messily. Just make sure and you cut out all those redundancies in the editing process so you don't annoy the reader. And once again, check out the link in the description to the Write Your Best Novel course and also to the Bookfox Academy if you want access to all my courses, and good luck with your writing.